Hi, I'm Dr. Rachel Bryant-Anderson, and this video is meant to complement the Sociology research paper genre guide. In this video, we'll be looking at a student example of a paper written in this genre. Like all papers, the one we'll be looking at isn't perfect, but it is a strong example of many of the principles that you should follow as you work on your own research paper. So here's our example, and it starts with the cover page, which is typical for a research paper. So you can note the formatting of this cover page, but one thing I wanted to call your attention to is the title. This gives us the clear and specific focus of the paper. I wanted to mention, though, that this is not where the paper started. So as mentioned in the research paper genre guide, it's definitely a process to narrow down to the focus of your paper. So this student likely started with something very broad as a focus, something maybe even as broad as education, and then progressively narrowed down from there. So maybe specified that what they really wanted to look at was how the U.S. educational system falls short, or how it doesn't live up to expectations in certain ways. And then eventually, through the research process, got to this focus on looking at other models of education systems from different countries and how the United States might benefit from following the same kinds of principles as those models. So it's definitely, as I said, a process to get to that point. But here the student, by the final draft, has landed on a very clear and specific focus for the paper. So if we move down to the paper itself, it also starts with the title and then jumps into the introduction. So there is no section header for the introduction, and that will be the only section in the paper that doesn't have a title to designate what the section is. Another thing you might notice about this introduction is that it's longer than we might expect from a typical essay, for instance. This introduction is actually more than one page. And that is not unusual for a research paper introduction. They're not all that long, but it's definitely not out of the norm for them to be that long, because a lot's going on in this introduction. So we can see that the student has set up the issue for us. They're providing some historical context, in this case about education, since that's the focus of the paper. And even within the introduction, they've started citing sources and giving some pretty specific information that they want their readers to know about the U.S. educational system. Of course, another very important thing that happens in this introduction is that the student establishes the thesis. So we can see that highlighted in yellow right here. And this is what the rest of the paper is going to follow up on. So it's very important that this is clearly and directly established in the introduction. So once we see this thesis, we can expect that the rest of the paper will be using published academic sources, the kinds of sources that are shown in the other video that accompanies this genre guide on how to read a journal article. So this paper will be similar to the literature review section of that video. The introduction and thesis also help to establish the organization of the paper. So we can tell from this thesis there are a number of themes that will need to be addressed in the sections that follow it. So this thesis says, to improve their education system and to ensure the highest quality education possible for all students, the United States should model their education system after both Finland's and Singapore's. So we know we're going to need some information about the United States and the education system in the US, and we're going to need information on Finland's education system and Singapore's education system in terms of what those systems involve and why we should consider them stronger models than the one we have in the United States. Another thing to notice about this introduction is that the student has already started to establish some of that specific information that they need to provide the reader in order to back up the claims in that thesis. So the foundation really of this paper is this assertion that the United States has an educational system that is of lower quality or that has weaker outcomes than the education systems in Finland and Singapore. And oftentimes students kind of forget to back up the central claims of their paper because they're so just embedded in what the student wants to say that sometimes it just kind of gets forgotten. But here, what's highlighted in gray above the thesis statement is a very specific set of statements that completely back up the claim about the United States having lower educational outcomes than Singapore and Finland. So the writer has given us the results, right, that the United States ranks 41st in math, 24th in reading, and 25th in science, and has compared that to the ratings for Finland and for Singapore. So they're telling us, that this is coming from research, right, and that there's research-based evidence to indicate that the United States falls short. So this is the kind of thing that needs to be happening throughout the paper, right? A claim is made, and then it's backed up by research-based evidence. After the introduction, we have sections with section titles. So as we kind of expected from what we saw in the thesis and introduction, there's going to be a section overviewing the United States educational system. And again, the section title very clearly and directly establishes that. And those titles really provide a clear roadmap for the reader that is extremely helpful, and they are necessary in these long research papers. The comparison I like to make is to a book. If I were going to pick up a book and it didn't have any chapters, it was just start to finish with no separation into chapters, I would feel really overwhelmed about reading that book. And the same can be true of a research paper that is long and involves a lot of information. The reader really needs those cues and kind of maps so that they don't have to try to keep the structure and organization and focus in their minds while they're trying to take in the content as well. So these sections are arranged by topic or theme, which is also very important. So you'll have a section organized around a particular topic or theme, and then broken into focused paragraphs within that section. This is different than organizing it by source. So what we don't want to see in a research paper is that you have first your summary of source 1, and then your summary of source 2, and then your summary of source 3. What we want to see is that the student has created their own points and narrative to flow throughout the paper, and that those points are backed up and developed with the published research you found through your research process. So all those sources that you've been collecting and reading are there to back up and provide evidence for your points, but you don't want to just summarize them within your paper. So we can see an example of this in this first section. The area highlighted in gray establishes the writer's point. So he's saying that there are specific factors that are creating negative impacts in the United States educational system, and that has to do with willingness to spend on education, its one-size-fits-all approach, and the lack of rigor in teacher preparation. So he has established that as the central focus. And then we can notice in this section with the turquoise colored highlights that he's drawing from several different sources just in this one paragraph to back up and support that point that he's made. So instead of summarizing these sources, he's pulling in the information that is relevant to that point to create a synthesized and cohesive discussion. And so, he's not going to summarize, for instance, COSEL 2005. He's going to use the information that's relevant. And then if there's other information that's relevant to a different section, he'll wait and use that information from Kozel in the section that it's appropriate within. So we'll continue to see sections identified by theme, with cohesive points, a cohesive narrative within them, and then backed up with published sources, primarily academic sources. We'll see that as we scan through the paper. So we've moved from the US educational system to Singapore, and we can see that there are several different sections on Singapore's educational system. So the writer has assumed that the readers are going to know more about the US educational system, and he's breaking down the discussion of the educational system in Singapore in quite a bit more detail, because he's assuming that we don't necessarily know much about that system. So we have several different sections on Singapore, and then we move to Finland. So another option that writer would have had is to have one section on Singapore and then created subsections within that. But the way he did it was fine as well. But we can see that now that we've moved on to Finland, he's got the same topics that he's covering for Finland as he did for Singapore. So that's going to help aid the cohesiveness of his discussion. He's talking about them in the same order, which aids with the structure and cohesiveness as well. So we're going to see lots of sections about Finland's educational system. And again, we're seeing lots of citations throughout that, which tells us that he's incorporating a lot of sources to develop and back up his points, to provide evidence for his points. And then the last section is the conclusion. So here, he's really tried to establish what he wants the reader to take away from the paper. This was a particularly long paper, so he's going to help us out by summarizing some of the central points, which are highlighted in gray there. These are things that he's already established in the sections above and really backed up with evidence in those sections. So he's just going to give us a quick reminder of, the points that he wants to pull together from those various sections and leave us with at the end. And then finally, we also get to kind of the central takeaway in terms of the practical implications of this research, which is, what he thinks the United States should be doing in order to make their educational system more like Finland's and Singapore's. And then, of course, very importantly, we also have a references section at the end. So we want to see that everything cited within the paper is also on this reference list, and that everything on the reference list is also cited within the paper. So it should be an exact match between the sources cited in the paper and the sources listed on the reference list. We can see that means there were a lot of sources used in this paper, right? The student did a lot of research by finding these academic sources for the most part, as well as some other kinds of sources. And he incorporated all of this into the paper to provide evidence to back up his claims. And so that's really what we're aiming for in the research paper process. So that gives us a sense of some of the principles to follow in research paper writing. And if you're looking for more information on this, please check out the research paper genre guide if you haven't already, as well as the video on how to read a journal article that also accompanies that guide.